medicine, dentistry and health. He does groundbreaking work on cardiovascular disease, which obviously, as you know, is one of the kind of big killers in the Western world. And he does that. He's part of a group that uses zebrafish embryos as a way of exploring the disease in humans, but using animal fish research. So not only is he kind of at the cutting edge of an important research problem for our society, he also has insights into things such as the ethics of how you go about doing such research. It's an incredibly interactive presentation he's got planned for us, so keep your fingers crossed that the technology keeps up. So over to you, Tim.
Well, when Kathy asked me to talk, initially I thought, wow, that's very exciting and very flattering. And that was almost immediately followed by a rush of terror and confusion as to what on earth I would tell you about that would be of any interest to a broad audience. And also, what on earth is a sustainable society, which was the other thing which I had to try and shoehorn my talk into. So, as Kathy said, I spend 50% of my time at the Northern General Hospital, where I'm a consultant cardiologist, seeing patients with a range of cardiovascular diseases. And I spend 50% of my time at the university doing research which may or may not be cutting edge, or which may or may not be of any interest to you, so we're about to find out. Since I'm both a doctor and a scientist, I am almost incapable of speaking plain English. Okay. So please, when, not if, I say something which is nonsense, please tell me. Okay. And certainly you wouldn't be the only person in the audience who I'm confusing. So, I'm actually more interested in hearing what you think about some of this stuff than I am about telling you about it. But obviously, I probably need to prepare the ground a bit before I get your views. I've been told that you're, in fact, feisty was the term that was used, and certainly I would welcome interruptions, questions, objections at any point through the talk. Now, I do a few talks like this, around and about, and as you know, as you probably suspect, you only ever tell people about the good stuff, okay? And when you show pictures, you only ever show them the beautiful new medical building in the Northern General. Oh, they're amazing, and I actually do work in First Court, so it's not a complete lie. But nevertheless, we do tend to give a polished version of what we're trying to do. But of course, this is also the Northern General Hospital. This is a chest clinic, okay, and this is also the university. Nothing wrong with either of those buildings. Nothing wrong with what goes on there. But I just use this as a bit of an analogy that what I'm hoping to do today, and this is completely new for me. I'm coming out of my comfort zone, talking about pathology, talking about molecules and genes, in an attempt to try and tell you something that's perhaps a bit more interesting. So just to check that your clickers are working, if you've availed yourself of the opportunity. Now, also, this is quite new for me, so this may or may not work, and I'm sorry if it doesn't. So if you've all got clickers, at some point, I'd like to answer the question, at some point in my life, I expect to need medical treatment. Polling is open, apparently. Oh, some of the clickers are working.
Which bit do you click? Or in
A or B? A for yes, B for no. So we've got 58 working clickers. I don't know if we've got 58 heads here. Sometimes you can click as many times as you want. And I think it only records your last rather than your first response. So you can even change your mind. Okay, I'm going to close. I'm going to say we've got 61 people here, hopefully. 8 people here expect to never require medical treatment in their life. That's interesting. It reminds me of the Woody Allen thing about not achieving immortality through their work, but achieving it through not dying. Sorry to break it to you, you're all going to die. Okay. So far. And probably that will be of some medical cause which may require treatment, but that's fine. So, basically, mostly I want to see whether the clickers were working. because otherwise I'd have to radically rethink what we're going to talk about. But clearly, this is of relevance to you, whatever your backgrounds, of which I'm unaware at the moment. The vast majority of you expect to require some medical treatment. So they should be of relevance. So from what you know of the NHS, okay, and this is again my awkward attempt to shoehorn it into the overall title, do you A, think it represents a sustainable model of healthcare? B, do you think it's an unsustainable model? And C, don't know, and I'll just better open the polling. Okay, click away. So we've got 6 people who don't know whether they don't know. 55 down here. Is anyone not clicking? Is anyone frantically clicking?
I think it's because we fixed the spare ones last time.
It shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter. Although, so you're trying to get 2 votes.
No, last time we used them, but this time we won't.
It shouldn't matter actually, but if you feel that yours isn't working. Anyway, these aren't the real questions. That's interesting, isn't it? So, some people think it is sustainable. It's quite an even split. So this is the Francis report, which came out quite recently, into the inquiry as to what happened at the Mid Staffordshire Hospital. I don't know if you've heard about this hospital, but various horror stories have been circulating in the newspapers for a long time about the care received by patients in the hospital. And certainly at an anecdotal level, that appeared to be horrendous in many individual cases. People left without any food or basic care on wards, and all these things get reduced into the most basic of terms: corrupt managers, incompetent and lazy consultant staff, evil nurses. Okay, but it does appear that whatever was happening in this hospital, which almost certainly wasn't related to any of those things, it did lead to an excess in deaths. So it wasn't just that your granny had an awful time when she was in with a broken hip. More people died in this hospital than would have been expected to. The excess, you pick it out of the air, between 400 and 1,200 people died who wouldn't if they'd been in any other hospital, average hospital in the UK. So this is important, and I come here with questions, not answers, but my feeling is that we're not really at a sustainable model of healthcare at the moment. So, okay, well, in the worst hospital in the UK, at least according to media opinion, up to 1,200 avoidable deaths. So this is a question for you. How many deaths overall in UK hospitals are avoidable? I would love to go into what that means. I'm not going to. You can interpret it as you like. 1 in 10, 1 in 20, 1 in 50, or 1 in 100 deaths in hospital are unavoidable. I don't think I've got any other responses on there, so I'm just going to go to 4 answers. Okay, click away. Have any of you died in hospital? To give you that insight. I'm not trying to drum up private practice either, since I don't do it. It still seems like there might be a few clickers that aren't working. Or people have gone to sleep even earlier than I expected in the talk. 1 in 20 is the right answer. And the majority of you get it right. So yeah, so 1 in 20 of the people that I see, which is an average ward round for me, 20 patients. One of them, one of the deaths that I would see I'll start again. Out of the 20 people that I see who die, unfortunately quite a lot of my patients die, one of them is supposedly avoidable. So, coming back to the sustainability strapline, there's certainly room for improvement, you could argue, based on those kind of statistics. And how do I know 1 in 20? Well, it's always a much more interesting question, is how do you come up with this data? But it was in the Guardian on Friday, so it must be right. So anyway, so that was mostly just to get the clickers working and see if they actually give us any useful information. What I would like you to think about, what I'm not going to tell you very much about, is what is the place of medicine in society? You know, is it always been the same? A lot of doctors, hark back to some previous golden age of what medicine was like. But actually, personally, I feel it's been changing forever. Whether it's improving or not, we have to discuss. And I think the key thing I want to kind of plant today is whose responsibility is health. To a certain extent, what is the right relationship between a patient and a doctor, or a customer and a client type relationship? And all this is a very elaborate backdrop to coming onto all this fish stuff that I do, as to whether you can really justify doing medical research, given where we're at the moment. Shouldn't we use that resource towards climate change or more equality? And it's difficult to talk about biomedical research without kind of raising what has previously been an elephant in the room. People were very reluctant to talk about the use of animals in medical research because of threats against them made by pressure groups. But really, I can't talk about what I do without mentioning it. So, just tell me, who's a humanities, who's a scientist, and who's an other? I don't know what would be an other, actually, but I thought I'd better put one in. You probably have this information already.
I do, but not in the... I couldn't tell you. But there'll be an interesting question of self-definition of those ones that straddle.
We're still getting fewer responses than we had for the whole "are you going to get sick" question. I think you probably have to press them quite hard. Sometimes, certainly, I've been playing with them. And okay, we'll close it then. Who's in the other? What subjects are you doing? Engineering. That's interesting. Oops. So, who's familiar with this? Okay, I'll start again. So this was a debate that happened in about the 50s, and it was, I think what it actually meant at the time has got completely lost, and certainly I don't really understand it. But what C.P. Snow was saying in this thing that's been shorthanded into called the two cultures is the big divide between humanities and scientists. And people use this as examples for lots of similar binary distinctions. But what in his original lecture he asked was, he said, well, the mark of a reasonably educated person is whether they've read a work of Shakespeare. And I'm going to ask you to do that. I'm going to cut it off pretty quickly because I can't remember Shakespeare. Too late? Okay. That's interesting. So, it's as at a dinner party, there would be a certain degree of judgment of someone's literary education if they had not read a work of Shakespeare. Though, of course, I think we have a debate as to whether that's valid. But what Snow said was, understanding of science is being restricted in a greater and greater fashion to these people that know about science, rather than it being more broadly understood. So, who can describe the second law of thermodynamics, which Snow felt was as simple a question from a scientific point of view as, have you read a bit of Shakespeare? Oh, yeah, well, it's a good question. Oops, it's no, yes and no. So, a very definite difference. I think I put in, yeah, there you go. Who's done both? When I was doing this, I thought, oh, I hope there's no engineers there, because I bet they've done both. All this polling takes much longer than I expected. Okay. So again, that would seem to suggest that we have, okay, Snow was right, there's a polarisation between humanities and scientists, literary people, people who understand how things work. So what I was really trying to get at, by the way, this is the second law of thermodynamics from my favourite data source. I'm a medic, so I wouldn't know, but apparently Shakespeare is some kind of Hollywood screenwriter. So what I feel now, and I feel this fairly passionately, that in today's society there's as big a divide between medics, by whom I mean anyone that understands the medical system, understands treatments, has that kind of background. I certainly wouldn't restrict it to just doctors. There's lots of allied professional systems, nurses, paramedics, etc. And then there's the rest, the non-medics. And I think the divide between these two groups is getting broader and broader all the time. Okay, what's a heart attack? And I'll tell you already that a heart attack is the single thing which is going to kill more people in this room than any other disease. Okay, so a third of you are going to die of a heart attack. Of course, how do I know that? Swine flu could get you first, or nuclear conflagration, but at current predicted trends, certainly a third of people in this country would tend to die of a heart attack. So it would be helpful to know what it is. What is it? I'm going to start cutting it off at 50 so we can move a bit quicker. So, more people think it's B. Acute interruption of myocardial blood flow. Spot on, okay? But quite a lot of people thought it was A. A heart attack can cause no symptoms, by the way. So that was put in probably to try and deliberately mislead you. But people's idea of what a heart attack is not necessarily the same as what as the truth. And I guess what I'm trying to say is this is very relevant. It's going to affect the vast majority of us, either personally or people that we know and care about. And so it seems at some level sensible to know a bit more about it than we currently do. Okay, so these are arteries. These are human coronary arteries. What I've done here is put some local anaesthetic in at the top of the leg and stuck this tube in up the artery up to the heart and injected some X-ray dye into the heart, which is moving around as a heartbeat. And this is the right coronary artery. It runs in a kind of C shape underneath the heart, and that provides a blood supply to the heart. This is the kind of thing that would get me out of bed in the middle of the night. This person's artery is completely blocked up. Okay, the dye is going down there, it's not going any further. And they're having a myocardial infarction, a heart attack. Okay. And the fact that they're here, you can see their heart is moving, that's a good sign. They're in hospital, that's also a good sign. But 50% of the people in whom this would happen to would just drop down dead at the football match or at home, and then they never get to hospital. So I'm quite interested in things that help blood vessels block, things that help blood vessels unblock, and things that grow new blood vessels in the first case. And I suppose to a certain extent what I try and do in my research is find ways that we could grow new blood vessels around here to restore blood supply to the heart or the leg or the brain, depending on the area that's affected. Okay. And this is really the kind of the medical justification for the research I do. I just took my car to the garage. Something was wrong with it. I have no idea what they did. I have no idea whether I got charged 10 times too much or a reasonable rate. But my car works. Okay. And so, do I need to know anything more about my car just because I use a garage service? Okay. Do you need to know anything about medicine? just because inevitably, despite what 8 of you think, you are probably going to require services of medics. Well, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that this was a conventional model of medicine. This is the golden age that some of my colleagues hark back to. Absolutely no eye contact. Very kind of, I know what's best for you. I have patients, I've met many patients who've had conditions for many years and they've never been told what they actually have or why they're on the treatment that they are receiving or what that treatment might do or whether that disease is going to kill them. So it's very easy to access healthcare, and it's quite common to access healthcare knowing nothing about the condition itself. Okay, and if you ask a lot of people who've had a heart attack, you know, the same question, they won't get the right answer necessarily. Okay. So, you know, it's not essential, but there's a definite trend towards, using the political term, no decision about me without me. And this is the prevailing trend in medicine, an open discussion of the options, informed consent. Now we could discuss again what does that mean. I mean, that means you have to understand why you're having something done, what the risks are, what the benefits are, what the likely or possible complications are. So, you know, I am very interested to know, which kind of doctor would you prefer? The first or the second? Clearly there's lots of different models, but at the two ends of the extreme. That's interesting. I think most people would say that. But when I'm in clinic and you give someone a 20-minute spiel, you could have this or this or this. If we do the first one, then the risks are this, but the benefits are that. And then the second one, well, okay, well maybe at the end of it, the vast majority of people go, what would you have? Which is effectively the same as saying, what should I have? And part of that is because they didn't know anything about this beforehand. I've given them a 20-minute brainwashing using terms that they may not have understood anyway, based on, you know, what their prior knowledge was. And so, although you would much prefer to have this model, allow me to gently question your ability to make the most of it. Okay. If you don't know much about medicine. Now, of course, you may well do already, but I do see a significant number of students in my practice. Hardly any of them got heart disease, by the way, I'm very pleased to say, but some of them are worried that they are. And then it doesn't really make much difference whether they're medical students or humanities students or science students. You know, they still don't know an awful lot about this stuff because it's not taught at earlier stages. So, you're admitted to hospital with a heart attack. How long do you think it would take me to take the average person, in fact, the average highly intelligent person, one of you guys, how long do you think it would take me to explain the diagnosis and treatment of a heart attack? 10 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, or more than an hour? Clearly there's no right answer, but what do you think would be an appropriate allocation of time based on what you understand at the moment? I think it's that magic 50. So, that's interesting. When my wife and I had a baby, we went to NCT classes for about 6 evenings and a weekend course to learn how to have a baby. So that was 12. It's about 20 hours of education. But the majority of you feel that 30 minutes is enough to know about what that thing is that you've just had a 50% chance of dying from and understanding the implications. I find that interesting. Unfortunately, 10 minutes is about what most people get. But I'm not sure that 30 minutes would really, and again it's open to debate, but I think if we chatted for 30 minutes about heart disease and the biological basis and the treatment, I'm not sure whether you really would be able to make informed or give informed consent. You'd feel more comfortable about what was happening, but I'm still not sure you would understand the nuances of treatment in order to make the right decision for yourself. But I'm not sure that's only opinion. And anyway, my patients only get 10 minutes on the ward round because I've since seen, sometimes 30 or 40 people in a ward round who've come in with this kind of condition. Okay, so you've had your 30 minutes. How much information do you retain immediately afterwards? And again, don't think about the average, just think about yourself. You're all very clever people. All you've done for years now is absorb and retain information to get where you are at the moment. So, I've given you 4 options. What's the likely retention rate? Sorry, it would help if I opened this. Clearly, I haven't tested you guys, but the average retention is 10%. And actually that's not very different to the average retention of information after a lecture, by the way, any of the lectures that we give. So even though you get your 30 minutes, which you feel is a reasonable allocation of time, 90% of the stuff that hopefully is relevant, you don't remember afterwards anyway. And retention of information is based on the prior framework into which you put those facts. If you know nothing about it before, then you're less likely to retain the information. So, I think you've said you want to know more about it, you want an informed kind of peer-to-peer discussion. There's a reasonable allocation of time involved, but unfortunately most people, even when put in those situations, don't retain much information. And then we come to kind of the fact that actually medicine, I'm sorry to tell you this, is an odds game. Okay, heart disease, those kind of people that had a heart attack, tends to present with central, tight, crushing chest pain. Okay, not always, it can be, have no symptoms, but that's generally the kind of typical feature. If I'm sent someone, a 22-year-old girl with central, tight, crushing chest pain, I immediately discount the possibility of it being a heart attack within reason, because actually 22-year-old young women don't get heart attacks usually. So medicine is all based on gambling, really. It's on playing the probabilities. It's not based on any individualisation of assessment, except in a very kind of primitive degree. And it's all based on risk. So imagine this. There's a disease, a rampant disease, affecting students. 1 in 1,000 students, okay? And clever doctors invent a test that's correct 95% of the time. That sounds quite good, so we test everyone. But one of you test positive. What is the chance that you have the disease? And these are the kind of terms that we talk about. You've got a 95% risk of this and a 30% risk of that. So, of the 4 options, what is the likelihood that you have the disease? Remember, you've tested positive. The test is 95% accurate. And you can imagine in the kind of the more modern day doctor-patient relationship, instead of saying, I've done a test and you've got this, you would say, well, I've done a test and the likelihood is, okay, so I've got your responses here. I'm very interested in what this shows. The answer is 2%. Well done to those people that worked that out. I would be very interested to know the backgrounds of the people that worked that out, because most doctors get this wrong. As would I have to say. So it's 2%. We probably haven't got time to go through why. The quarter of you who understood that could explain it to the 3/4 of us who don't. But when you're playing statistics as much, you're playing the odds as much as we do in medicine, it does come up with some kind of rather counterintuitive results. And the number of people I see who've had a medical, okay, because it seems like a good idea. You've got Bupa insurance, why not go and have a medical? There's nothing wrong with them, they're not complaining of anything, so the risk of picking up something in the first case is quite low. But of course, if you scan someone, do a whole body scan, which you can buy for a couple of £100, and you pick up a cyst on the liver or a bit of calcification somewhere else, that can trigger an enormous amount of medical investigation and indeed treatment, which wouldn't necessarily be doing you any good whatsoever, because your likelihood of having a problem in the first place was already quite low. So statistics and medicine are really closely intertwined. So when a drug is prescribed for diabetes, we give them tablets, regular tablets, long-term, the rest of their life. Now everyone forgets a tablet from time to time. If you've ever been on a course of antibiotics for 2 weeks, the likelihood of taking every single one of those tablets is quite low. So we set a cut-off of acceptable compliance at about 80%. So when I give people these tablets, what proportion of patients take at least 80%? Very good. Spot on. The majority of people, 66%. A lot of these drugs are expensive. A lot of them get dispensed. The person takes the prescription that they get free in the vast majority of cases. They take those expensive tablets at home. 40% of them never get taken. Just stick in a cupboard somewhere. Someone here is bound to have a granny like mine who, has a cupboard full of tablets that she's never taken. So, and we know that actually if you tell people why you're taking these tablets and the benefits that they might get out of it, unsurprisingly, actually they take more of their tablets. Or at least they have the courage to say, actually I'm not going to bother taking blood pressure tablets, because I know now that 900 of the 1,000 people that you're giving these to get no benefit. So I'm just going to take my chance. So I think people do need to know more about medicine to inform their choices, and it would probably save money. How many years fewer does smokers live on average? I'll give you 5. Very good. So, some people think, 3 people think, you only lose 3 years of your life on average if you smoke. Well, it's worse than that. It's 10 years on average. Okay. So these people have an overly rosy impression of the risks of smoking. So definitely shouldn't be allowed to smoke until someone at least tells them, this is what you're doing. These people are denying themselves the joy of smoking based on an unrealistic expectation of the risks involved. Now, I'd be very happy if you wanted to talk about whether or not, what the role of civil liberties are or personal choices in all these things. I honestly don't know. We've made big advances by making motorcyclists wear helmets, by enforcing seatbelts, by banning smoking. Whether we want to do that is another matter, but I think that at the very least, if you're going to do something which has that much impact, you should know. And smokers are not better informed than anyone else as to the risks. I suspect less so. So I think just knowing about the implications of that biscuit that you had downstairs, what are the health implications of things we do? If you know about these things, then you can make informed choices. If you don't, then you can't. It's just guesswork. So, that basically is why I wanted to start like this, because for the first time in my career I have the opportunity to try and get a broader range of people who are going to go off and be teachers and politicians and academics and business people. And I think, you all, if you understand medicine more, then you'll certainly be able to understand and evaluate the care provided by healthcare providers. I think you'd be able to reduce your personal risk of disease. That's not to say you have to do that. Doctors love skiing, you know. That's not reducing your personal risk of at least injury, but at least it's based on an informed position, hopefully. I think this is the thing that I'd be really keen to see, is that, you know, you're mostly going to do non-medical career paths, but you're all going to be in a position to influence the health of yourselves and others. But you can't really necessarily do that unless you understand medicine. And you know, there seems to be a strong element of political debate, at least in the talk that I heard earlier. And this so often comes down to lazy doctors, evil nurses, corrupt NHS middle management. And I think, you know, that debate is not well informed and could be better led by people like you. But anyway, yeah, hi.
It's just related to all the questions that you just asked. At the beginning you asked, would you like to be informed more about the decision? But it's not just about the information, it's a little bit about the trust. So if someone takes 10 minutes to tell you about what's happening to you, you will trust them more, whether or not it helps you make the decision. So I think maybe the first question you asked doesn't just inform you about the other questions that followed. There's other aspects.
I completely agree. And actually, although I would say I would rather have an informed conversation, I think you're right. It's more about, do I trust this person rather than do I believe the rubbish that they're telling me.
And maybe that's why people have labelled it as like evil nurses or all these things, because
Evil nurses, you might have to explain that to me.
Evil nurses.
If someone hasn't
Evil nurses, my apologies.
No, I mean, maybe that's why people have this adverse reaction to the idea that you don't get informed. It's not because they would maybe use the information well, it's because they like to know that they've got a choice, or even if they don't use that choice, they just like to know that someone cares enough to give them that choice.
I agree. I think it's less about the facts that you're given, at least in the current setting,
Yeah.
but more about just feeling comfortable with what's happening to you in what is always a kind of slightly depersonalising, you know, removal of your own autonomy. You know, when you get wheeled down a corridor with a... No, I completely agree. Equally, is that right? You know, that's another way of deciding, okay, I'm just going to let this guy or lady decide for me, but I just want to check that I've made, you know, that they're the right person to resort to the, just tell me what I do. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. I just think
They're not mutually, sorry, no, you say you just...
They're not mutually exclusive, and it shouldn't just be about being completely informed, because you're probably, if you're in hospital, you're probably in less of a state to make an informed decision anyway because of the emotions attached to being ill. So...
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The people I have least, the people I encounter who least want to hear all about a heart attack are people currently having a heart attack. Which, to a certain extent, backs up my feeling that people should know more about this in advance. But of course, everyone makes that one. People should know more about politics. People should know more about architecture or literature or whatever. I mean, and I guess the question is how you draw that balance. Anyway, this might upset you. How good is medicine anyway? So what is your current view of medicine? Extremely advanced, fairly advanced, room for improvement, or primitive? Sorry, I was covering up there. That says people look back on us in 20 years and think, I can't believe how rubbish medicine was. Very interesting. No one thinks we're extremely advanced. Oh, MRI scanners and millions of pounds worth. 9 people think current medicine is primitive. I would press D. Okay. But of course C is a very reasonable kind of middle of the road view to have. And it's certainly not more comfortable to think C than it is D, but I think it's D. But again, it's just a personal view. You go and see a doctor for a symptom. I've chosen pain in the back, pain in the head, pain in the chest. What percentage of these cases can currently be medically explained? The thing is, you guys have been brought up on multiple choice. So you actually don't need to know anything. You know about this. Oh, okay, he's got 100 ahead here, so it's probably going to be in between the two. Oh, okay. So I am more kind of negative about what we know already, but you guys think we only know 50% of what's going on. It's 66%. I mean, again, where do you get these numbers from? It's going to vary all the time. But probably, it depends on the specialty as well. In some specialties, we understand what's happening only 10% of the time. But on average, in a GP surgery, they'll have a reasonable medical idea of what's happening in 66% of consultations. Which of course means there's quite a lot of stuff that we don't even understand. We don't even have a name for it. So, okay, we don't even know what that stuff is, so we can't treat it. When we have got something we have a name for, how do we know a treatment is effective? Well, medicine is full of anecdote. I gave my patient this and they survived, so it must be the right treatment. And that's, of course, been what's backed up most of medicine for centuries. Observational studies are a bit more scientific, as in we looked at everyone who'd had a certain type of hernia operation, and the people that had this hernia operation did better than that. Well, there's some clear flaws there. So now we've got this thing, randomized control trials, which there's still problems, but say you all need a hernia operation, and we randomize you so that you all get one type, you all get the other type. You have no choices for which you receive, and then you count what's happened. So that is the gold standard of a not very good list of techniques to work out if our treatments are effective. Okay. So a GP is giving you a treatment for that symptom that they may or may not have known what was caused by. What's the likelihood that there's randomized controlled trial data that it works? And again, I think you're a very informed bunch of people. You're definitely down towards the lower end, and that's absolutely right. 25%, in fact, answer D. Only a quarter of treatments that a GP would prescribe actually have good evidence that they work, which means 75% of the stuff, it may work, it may not, maybe based on anecdote. We don't know. So this was written in 1922. By Dr. Pitt, who felt he was astounded by the pace of change and the improvements. He did, in the later part of his discussion, talk about, well, there is of course the fact that women still die in childbirth, and streptococcal infections, which are those things that you'll all have had, still kill hundreds and hundreds of people. But it's safe to say, room for improvement. But we're doing really well. I think he would have ticked C if I'd given him the same question as before. Since this address, penicillin, which of course has a history in Sheffield, it kind of first came available about 1942. My gran was born in the 1920s. And a large proportion of the patients that I see were born before we had any treatments that were really very effective. So in a space of one lifetime, we've gone from being able to do very little, women dying in childbirth all the time, to be able to cure infections, This is 1949. We've made great advances in public health. I'm not anti-smoking, by the way. Don't let me put your smoking. If you smoke, I see you as my pension. And actually, we've got engineers here, we'll have maybe other people, but technology is what's driven a lot of medicine. MRI scanners, okay, mobile phones that monitor your heartbeat. And so it's technological advances which have really driven a lot of medical advances. And technology is not slowing down. Moore's law and the improvements in computer processing power are really driving faster and faster change in medicine. So much so that a computer doctor, a robotic doctor, something that can actually process all the information and come up with the right treatment, is a very real possibility. Actually, it's going to be available and possible much earlier than it would be acceptable, I suspect. That's a different question. So this is Jo Ward. Now, she is a patient of mine, but she is on the British Heart Foundation adverts, the TV adverts. She had a heart attack. She had a heart attack for an unusual reason, which is because she was pregnant. Okay, and that heart attack greatly damaged the amount of pumping function of her heart, so it's barely moving at all. She had to have a bypass operation. You can just about see a scar there where a surgeon used a circular saw to right down there, pull the ribs apart, stick a few tubes on, close it up, because inevitably at some point her heart will go into an abnormal and life-threatening rhythm. Underneath the skin here she's got an implantable defibrillator which will monitor the heart rhythm and, if required, give an electric shock. An electric shock to an entirely un-anaesthetised and probably awake patient. And these things go off accidentally. For people, I saw a guy yesterday who had it put in just going off all the time. There's nothing wrong with him, but the device was wrong. Okay. And that bloody hurts. It's like being kicked in the chest. So, we've come a long way in a very short period of time. Okay. But frankly, there's still an awful lot that we can do. And in 20 years, I would expect that, all this stuff, electric shocks and, circular saws, hopefully that's all going to be rather outdated. So, I shouldn't say this, but this is my own view. Brilliant. I'm not trying to run down medicine. Don't be terrified about going to your local hospitals. We can do a lot. But actually there's probably at least as much left to do. It is expensive. And you guys are all the ones that are going to pay for it. And you've got to work out what you pay for it. Actually, if you go to this train station, the Manor, then the people that live there are 6 times more likely to have a stroke than if you live outside here. So there's lots of inequalities there. And clearly that's not something that a doctor sitting in a hospital can do something about. That's something that you guys are more equipped to deal with. And that is a very long-winded justification of why I do research rather than just see patients. Because research is not uniformly considered appropriate. This is Chris Boardman, who I admire greatly, okay? Terrific cyclist, good commentator. He wrote to the British Heart Foundation in 2002 saying, "No useful information will be gained by cutting open dogs, cats and other animals, subjecting them to painful, irrelevant experiments. We already know a healthy, low-fat diet and regular exercise is the key to preventing heart disease." Do you agree? I don't mind what you say, and I certainly wouldn't want you to feel... Oops, I'll give you some responses. My own feeling on this has not been the same through the course of my life. As I say, I've never done this before, and it's quite interesting to know, quite reassuring to know actually, that more people are against than with. Though, his viewpoint is perfectly reasonable. I'll just remind you what he said. we already know a healthy, low-fat diet and regular exercise is the key to preventing heart disease. He would say that, wouldn't he? Although, that one's a bit easier to knock down. This is the most recent guy, attempted to drop down dead on a football pitch. He did drop down dead. London Marathon girl died in the London Marathon, raised a fortune afterwards, posthumously. Lots of footballers. I've stopped updating the slide, but the number of healthy people who,
Is making sports your job healthy anyway? Because isn't it like massively extreme to, run marathons all the time? It's going to put a lot of pressure on the body. I would say that obviously they are healthy, but can't you be too much into sports? Isn't it going to be damaging?
I see what you mean. So you're suggesting that these guys are at the extreme end and potentially... That's a fair point. I guess the problem is the 12-year-old school footballer who drops down dead doesn't even get to the newspapers often. So I'm not trying to suggest that the more and more exercise you do, definitely the better. Although, frankly, I don't think the healthcare crisis facing us is largely driven by endurance exercise. I'm not trying to diminish your point. I think you're absolutely right. But these are just well publicised examples. And I'm not sure they dropped down dead because they were doing that exercise either. They've all almost certainly inherited a genetic condition which predisposes them to this. And there's young people dropping down dead in nightclubs, pubs, etc. It's not just exercise, although exercise can provoke it in certain syndromes. But I guess what I would say is we put heart disease all together because heart attack is the key thing. But actually, heart disease, there's lots of different types of heart disease. Some of them are influenced by exercise. Okay, some of them are made more likely by endurance exercise, which is coming to your point, which is very relevant. But actually, there's lots of things which are not the same, and so you need to know what kind of heart disease you're talking about. And the point really was we know enough about how to prevent this. That was Chris Boardman's point. Stop now. Ban biscuits, make tobacco illegal, or just educate people or whatever. You've got to choose your strategy. We could stop now. And that's a reasonable point. Look how healthy you all are. We all live to a ripe old age. I'm not saying we have to keep going and going and going, although it's possible. Not all medical research needs to use animals. Most probably does not, particularly if it's observational or if it's health services research. How do you stop people? We already know smoking's not good. You don't need to make beagles smoke to prove that. But what is the best way of stopping people smoking? That's kind of health services research. But the stuff I do does require use of animals, and this is because it tends to take a rather classical scientific approach, which is not the right one. Actually, one of the reasons I like talking to non-scientists is I learn how my way of thinking is not the only way of thinking, or even necessarily the best way of thinking. It's just a scientific way of thinking. But what biomedical stuff does is usually you change something, you change a gene, or you give a drug, and then you see what happens. And to be able to change something, you need to have a tool that will allow you to do that. I can't change any of your genes to see what happens, and I'm not sure you'd want me to anyway. So to answer some questions, you do need to use an organism. And all medical therapies are passed through preclinical, which is a rather wet term for animal studies. Sorry, prior to lunch. He was a healthy volunteer who was administered a drug called TG1412 at Northwick Park, along with 6 other healthy volunteers. They rapidly got sick, nearly died. Amazingly, none of them died. They lost their fingers, they lost their toes, their kidneys packed up. Who here would take a drug that had never previously been administered to an animal before? Now, that drug that the patient or the healthy volunteer had received had been tested in primates before. Actually, there was a signal from that study that something was not right. which in hindsight you would say, I'm not having that. But it didn't pick it up very clearly. So you could say, yeah, fine, no, we're not going to try that. It didn't work for that particular drug. Or you might say, well, okay, you can't catch them all, you can't win them all, but I'm still not sure I want to take a drug that can do that to my fingers until I've got some idea of what it does to another animal. Either would be perfectly justifiable. The response rate is slowing significantly unless the batteries are running out. Yes, sir?
Doesn't this depend on how desperate you are?
You can infer the degree of desperation yourself.
How do they even allow a drug to be tested before it was tested on primates? I thought all drugs had to go through a series of testing on animals.
No, it was tested on primates first. The primates their fingers didn't drop off, but their blood test did show some changes which in retrospect might have made them more cautious in putting it into first in man. So yeah, they do, absolutely. But I guess what we're discussing is should they? Yeah, you were saying?
Isn't there a bigger issue that people like you don't actually ever get to see the first sort of trials that do show sort of negative responses to drugs?
You're talking about the Ben Goldacre.
It's never published, really.
Yeah, so there's a very good book called Bad Pharma, Pharma, by Ben Goldacre, which discusses some of those issues. And certainly there is some cause for concern about the conduct of clinical studies and how available information is made, given that all these studies cost a fortune. And who pays for them? It's the companies that make the drugs. So there's clearly, in large part, so there's clearly a conflict of interest there, potentially. After having read all that stuff, I'm not sure that drug companies are necessarily any more corrupt than almost any other institution you care to mention. And in previous talks, we talked about press. I guess you touched on politics. Even higher education is not without its issues.
Journals that are only going to publish the results that give literature.
Yeah, I mean, there's less evidence that journals will only publish positive studies, but though it's a very widely held belief. I mean, I think you're right. I think the first question is, should we do the studies? And the second, I suppose, is a follow-on, is to, what do you do with that information? How do you ensure that you disseminate it correctly, that you actually benefit from conducting the study? I guess is.
He also talked about the problem with that study is that they administered the drug in the same high levels to all the same patients at the same time, which they shouldn't have done anyway. They should have spread it out too much.
They didn't think there were high levels at the time, but yeah, why would you give more than one person the first dose? But to a certain extent, I mean, clearly there are some errors there, and there's probably errors conducted in any experiment, but sometimes you get away with it, sometimes you don't. I think rather than the specifics of what was done there, the question I'm most interested in is whether you feel that before you go to first-in-man studies, which will always eventually, inevitably, come to some disaster. That's why you're doing it. If there's no risk of an adverse effect, then you don't need to do these studies. So it's not like we thought this could never happen. I think there's better ways to do it, perhaps. But yes, sorry, there's a question.
Quick question. The study that you showed was really old, actually. Well, very old. The one that went completely wrong. And after that, a lot of countries introduced new laws that more strict trials and more money when needs to be invested. Do you think that acts as a barrier now for new drug development? Because we are advancing in technology, so now we can sequence any human being and we can adapt anything we do. So don't you think that those considerations that have been introduced after those failures in medical trials are not actually good now, like right now?
I'm going to contradict my own approach and say I don't want to give a yes or a no answer to that. I mean, I think what usually seems to happen is you have a disaster, you get extra layers of regulation for very good reasons, but the law of unintended consequences means that sometimes that doesn't necessarily lead to the outcomes that you wanted. And your colleague's point before about, well, even when we get the studies done, there's a lot that we could do to improve how we use the information that's gathered in that way. So, yeah, I mean, clearly it has the potential to put off therapeutic advances. Equally, clearly it has the potential to reduce exposure of people in these studies to harm. So, you know, there's rather a balance, and it's hard to know exactly what the right answer is. I better move on, but I don't. Sorry.
It's just, I think that the way that animals are treated is also an important part of it. So, like, if you do something that causes them a lot of pain, you can obviously make that less bad.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think the first question is, can you use animals full stop? But I take your point, because if you say no, then you don't need to talk about their conditions. If you say yes, and of course it's always a qualified yes, then you can debate, you know, okay, what's acceptable, what isn't. But for the purposes of today, really, I just wanted to bring it up as a subject for you to think about. I mean, you'll all have different views. Really, you know, trying to summarise them as an A, B, C, D type response is completely artificial and clearly going to be inaccurate, because probably if you wrote down your views on this, no one view would match another one's. But forgive me, I'm just going to move on. So I've said we need more medical research, in my view, because we could improve on what we're delivering. And I've said you probably need to use animals. So I'm just going to briefly introduce regenerative medicine. How are we doing for time?
It is.
I think I've got.
It's past. We've got half an hour.
So that's a human heart in a preparation in Harvard. And I want to talk about regenerative medicine. Okay, I've got another question here. You had a heart attack, a bit like Joe Ward, that girl. It's killed 30% of the pumping function of your heart. How much improvement in that function can current medical treatment achieve? I'll give you 4 options there.
That's all that.
For some reason this is kind of news.
I think it's because you didn't do the poll
Ah.
on the last one.
Okay, sorry. I knew this would happen at some point. Brilliant. Thank you. So heart failure is not a very good term, but it's a growing problem where something's damaged your heart muscle, like a heart attack. We've kept people alive much better than we did before, but then they live on with a damaged heart, and that then leads to other diseases which kind of overall are called heart failure. How much improvement can we get? I'm going to cut you off there. Okay, a nice kind of even spread. I didn't want to put 0% because it sounded too pessimistic, but probably it's about between 0 and 1%. Although, thanks for believing in me, those two. That's not to say we can't make people live longer when their heart muscle is damaged. We clearly can. Putting in a defibrillator that restarts the heart when it decides to stop, that makes you live longer, but it doesn't actually improve the underlying problem, which is the heart muscle is knackered and doesn't pump very well. Is it currently possible to grow a human heart from a single cell? Yes or no? Is this a double bluff? Why would he ask such an obvious question? The answer must be no, but if it's no, why is he asking it? Oh! Very interesting. I think you're probably both right. Clearly, some of you are probably thinking, well, if he could, then he would be doing that probably by now. The answer is a qualified yes. It is currently possible because you've all done it. You all started off as a single cell, a single fertilized egg within your mother. Okay? And from that single cell, it had all the genetic information and the signaling cues to develop into the beautiful organisms that you are now, with hearts and livers and lungs So yes, it's possible. It clearly is possible. You've shown that already. So you know the practicalities of the experiment, or the possibility of the experiment, is you've demonstrated it. The question is, can you get it to happen again? And really, that is the entirely unproven hope for regenerative medicine. You did it once, we must be able to do it again, would be the strap line.
Isn't there somewhere in the States where they have managed to grow organs on a chip or something? I was listening, it was the Today programme, and I didn't understand what the chip was. They had grown something.
Yeah, there's, I mean, frankly, yes. I mean, we clearly going from where we are now to putting it into a human being is a series of huge number of much smaller steps. But for example, someone recently got the Nobel Prize for being able to take a skin cell and turn it into pretty much any other cell you want it to. So reprogramming it into a type of stem cell. And actually we already use stem cell therapy, we used it for years in terms of bone marrow transplants, where you are using single cells and you're regrowing an organ, in this case the bone marrow. And that's routine for lots of leukemias. So actually regenerative medicine's been going on for a long time, but it makes a bit of a leap when you go to solid organs with 3D structures like the heart or the brain, for example. So yeah, we're trying, but it's not available on the NHS currently, at least. And that really is the very long-winded introduction to my own research, which I'm only briefly going to touch on. But the British Heart Foundation, you know, they released all these adverts saying that the zebrafish was giving hope, and they're trying to raise £50 million to mend broken hearts by using regenerative medicine approaches. What on earth? Zebrafish? What's that got to do with me? Fortunately, you know, what happens in evolution is you can't invent something from nothing. You have to use the processes which were available earlier in evolution, and yeah, you might adapt them, but generally speaking, it has to have been there present for you to start using it. And that's effectively what conservation means. We're higher organisms than fish for sure, but we use or we adapt existing processes which were present in evolution, you know, millions of years ago. Blood vessels are evolutionarily ancient. Okay, organisms had blood vessels long before humans came on the scene, and we've just used the same processes to make our own blood vessels. And the same genes that make blood vessels in a zebrafish are the ones that make blood vessels in a human. Unlike humans, okay, so we're interested in how normal embryos form because that's what we want to switch on in patients. You all developed inside a uterus, as all mammals do, and actually that makes it very difficult to study how normal embryos pattern. This is a zebrafish embryo, it's doing exactly the same things that you all did in the first few days of life, but it's just in a petri dish, which means you can observe it. And there you can see an eye forming, and you're getting the typical vertebrate body plan of lumps of muscle going around the central spinal cord. So developmental biologists, people who are interested not necessarily in pathology but in how organisms form, they love zebrafish, and you can see why. Now these are 3-day-old zebrafish embryos, and they look just like tadpoles, they don't look like fish yet. This is a 5p piece. So you can see they're small, so you need microscopes. But we're also able to switch on and switch off genes very easily, something I can't do in you. And for example, we switched on a fluorescent gene in the nuclei of the endothelial cells here, and also a red fluorescent gene in the blood. This is a living organism, it's just under the microscope, but because it's largely transparent, you can use fluorescence microscopy to get a 3D reconstruction. So compared to sticking in a needle and injecting X-ray dye into my patients just to get a picture of the arteries, which only 999 out of 1,000 people survive anyway, I can just do this again and again on a fish without having to instrument them. You don't have to do anything unpleasant to them. So it really helps me see what I'm interested in, which in this case is how blood vessels form. I didn't really want to talk about generalities. It's very easy to zebrafish are great for this, medical research is going to cure all diseases. I actually wanted to show you the nastier parts of the Northern General Hospital. So I'm going to give you an example of how focused and specific, and so almost completely irrelevant to you guys, some of the research is, but just to give you some realistic view. This is a baby, this is their heart, this is the aorta, the main blood vessel that comes out. The baby's on its side, so you're looking kind of straight through from the side. This is the aorta, and there's a narrowing there. So this baby's aorta is not formed correctly, it's got a coarctation, a narrowing, which is preventing the blood from getting down into the body, putting pressure on the heart, and the baby gets heart failure. We operate on this nowadays. Sometimes it's not so tight, and so you don't know about it, and it presents in later life, in 20s, 30s, 40s. Sometimes it presents when they rupture, in which case you just die. So that can happen to anyone. The likelihood of anyone here having it is low, but there's 100 people in Sheffield with an aortic coarctation. This is a very rare condition. Unfortunately, it's lethal in the 15 children who've suffered it. They have a mutation in a gene PTH1R. It doesn't really matter what it is, frankly, although it's responsible for bone formation. We knew that already. And so, not surprisingly, they've got a mutation in a gene which is important for bones. They don't make the bones very well, and they die. Thank heavens it's only 15 cases in the world. But what was interesting is that half of those babies had an aortic coarctation. Now, most people with an aortic coarctation, they look like you and me. They haven't got bone problems. They haven't got other... We don't know that they've got genetic defects. Whereas in this very rare disease, for some reason 50% of the babies have got an aortic coarctation, which is quite interesting. The question is it anything to do with the mutation? Because you've seen that the babies unfortunately are messed up, and that in itself could cause developmental defects. So we wondered whether or not parathyroid hormone receptor 1, PTHR1, is actually needed for aortic formation. If that's your research question, and there's no reason to suggest that it should be, but if it was, I can't test that in you. I can't switch off that gene in you and see what happens to your aortas. And indeed, it's very difficult to do it in other species. So you need to use novel approaches. Now this is a zebrafish embryo, the head's at this end, this is the aorta, this is the blood moving intersegmental vessels here. So the arrow points to the aorta. This is a normal fish. You can't see that at the back, but if I just take out the background, there's the blood just moving. Again, this is the kind of thing you can do in a developing embryo without having to do anything to it, and then you can make an angiogram which shows you where the blood's going. Now if we switch off this gene, the gene which was responsible for the disease in the babies, I don't know if you can see here, I'll just move it to there's a complete blockage in the aorta here, it doesn't go any further, and you can see that on the angiogram there. So actually this study, it answers this very small focused question. Do you need this gene to make an aorta? The answer is yes. Okay. So what would be a very reasonable response, but nevertheless we've answered the question. We wondered why you get this blockage. So this is one of these transgenics that has green fluorescent protein just in the blood vessels and red fluorescent protein in the blood. This is a normal one. And in the fish without, when we switched off PTHR1, they've got no aorta here, it's just completely stopped. So this isn't a blockage because they haven't got a hole in the middle of the tube, they just don't have the wall of the tube at all. How is this happening? So we wondered how the cells are talking to each other. Now you're effectively just a collection of cells. Everything you believe about yourself is basically just a construct to keep all those cells alive. And most of your cells, if I took them out of your body and put them in plastic in an incubator, they'd live quite happily without, all your hopes and dreams and ambitions. Okay, so the basic unit of an organism is a cell. But of course, for you to work properly, your cells need to communicate. And one of the ways that cells communicate is something called notch signaling. Now this is something that tells neighbours. It doesn't signal to cells beyond, but it just like you would try to talk to each other in the row next to you. One cell switches on what's called a ligand or a key. The other cell switches on the keyhole, and that sends signals to the nucleus. So it tells this cell to be purple and this cell to be red. Or, for example, it tells okay, I'm going to be a hair cell, so you better not be a hair cell, which means the next cell can be a hair cell or a feather cell. So that's how you space out some of this patterning when you form as an embryo. Now this is another transgenic fish, which we've made to express green fluorescent protein where there is this signalling going on. So where cells are switching on not signalling, it goes green. This is where the aorta is going to form in a normal, and this is where the aorta is going to form when we've switched off this gene, and there's no not signalling where you get the blockage. Oh, I actually promised myself I wouldn't show graphs, but anyway I have. Last one. If we switch back on not signalling, they don't get the defect. Okay, so we rescue the abnormality in a fish. What have we learned? Hardly anything. Okay, after 3 years of work, lots of funding, we know a bit about why these rare babies with blonde strands have aortic abnormalities. Okay, we know that for sure. We know for sure it's the mutation that they've got which has led to the aortic defect. We think, and we're only extrapolating, that actually this not signalling pathway is important in aortic formation generally, and even if some of you actually will have aortic differences, defects if you like, 1% of you, and probably we think not signalling when you were born is one of the reasons why some of you will have these differences. And if we can switch on or control not signalling, this could be a useful therapy if we can do it in a controlled manner. So just to summarise, what I wanted that example to show you is that biomedical research is unbelievably and maddeningly slow, and any single study tells us hardly anything. Very limited, specific scientific question takes you months or years to answer it. Hopefully you get a question at the end of it. So it's only putting all those things in their entirety that tells us anything more broadly. But if we want to move forward, and that's really the decision for you guys, we could stay as we are, fine. We've got quite good healthcare. We've got quite good drugs if you take them, which a lot of people don't. But if you want to move forward, we do need research. And just to come back to the university strapline, if we discover, then we'll understand. But I think if we understand, then we might be able to treat. Thank you very much for your attention.